Hello and welcome to the latest of Jinnah Institute's live weekend webinar series brought to you by our strategic security program that aims to promote peace, stability, and security in South Asia and the wider region. My name is Amara Durrani. I'm Senior Fellow with the Jinnah Institute, and I'll be your host for our discussion today. The subject of our discussion today is negotiating the endgame in Afghanistan, a tale of many peace processes. Following the February 29th pact between the US government and the Taliban, both sides have held up their respective end of the bargain more or less. The violence remains entrenched in Afghanistan, unfortunately, and yet in parallel, we have the Kabul government and the Taliban engaged in a highly challenging peace process of negotiation and CBMs that we hope could lead to the start of an intra Afghan dialogue that everybody is anticipating. These developments show that the earlier pessimism about the futility of dialogue for bringing an end to America's longest war in the region is slowly being replaced with calculated interest in as well as expectations from the process. Interestingly, the scenario may have historical parallels with the previous peace efforts in the war ravaged history of Afghanistan, such as the Geneva Accords in 1988, the Peshawar Accord in 1991, and the Bonn Agreement more recently in 2001. Ravaged by nearly half a century of violent conflict, will the 2020 endgame bring a permanent peace to Afghanistan? And more importantly, what are the prospects for an abiding, sustainable intra Afghanistan reconciliation and effective post conflict governance in Afghanistan? We're very fortunate to have today with us an eminent and distinguished panel of speakers who bring first hand, long standing policy experience, analytical expertise on Afghanistan and the wider region. And we hope that their insights and their comments, observations, and recommendations will create a big picture scenario for our audience. We're streaming live on Jinnah Institute's YouTube and Facebook channel. We're also live tweeting key points of their session through the Jinnah Institute Twitter handle, and we welcome comments and questions from our audience. We will try our best to take some of the questions from our audience and pose to the panel. I'll quickly introduce our distinguished speakers for today. The session will be chaired by President Jinnah Institute, Senator Sherry Rahman. She's former federal minister and Pakistan's ambassador to the United States. She's currently chairing Pakistan Senate Standing Committee on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Welcome, Sherry. Our speakers include Ambassador Dr. Umar Zakhalwal, who is an Afghan politician. He has held senior ministerial portfolios in Afghan government. He has also been ambassador to Pakistan and a solid advisory track record for working with multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations in Afghanistan. We have Dr. Marvin Weinbaum, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's a former U.S. State Department official. He has long been associated with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., where he is currently director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies. We're very glad to have Ambassador Riaz Umar Khan, who is Pakistan's former foreign secretary. A mathematician and quantum physics specialist by training, he has held through his career senior diplomatic positions in China, Central Asia, Europe, the US, the UN. He also served as Director General of Afghanistan and Soviet Affairs at the Pakistan Foreign Office. He is an author on a couple of books on Afghanistan and has held a number of stints at international think tanks. We're very pleased to have Barnett Rubin, arguably having the most popular Twitter handle on everything Afghanistan. His latest book has just come out. Barney is a long standing expert on Afghanistan. He has been a former advisor to the US government and the United Nations in Afghanistan, and he's currently director of the Afghanistan Regional Project at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. Last but not least, we have Ambassador Omar Samad, a former Afghan diplomat and former Afghan government official. He has held diplomatic positions in Europe and North America. He is currently the Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council. I welcome all of our distinguished panelists. I request Senator Sherry Rahman to present her opening remarks.
Yes, thank you, Amara, and thank you all for joining at this early hour in Washington and, of course, evening in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I will just make a few brief remarks, share concerns which I hear emanating from Pakistan, and we'll look forward to a deeper discussion at the end. Right now, I want to just flag three things. One is that clearly this transition is long in the coming and it's been discussed as a particularly long awaited withdrawal. The ambiguity about American withdrawal is very clear in all conversations, both public and private, both in Afghanistan as well as Pakistan, for the simple reason that the business of state structure is naturally a conversation that requires better footholds and requires what we would consider some kind of blueprint for state solvency, which is not really continuously telegraphed. So I'm voicing a worry from a teenager who spent the last American and Soviet withdrawal, or rather the American disengagement and the Soviet withdrawal, in the last time this happened in the Soviet jihad, and we saw Pakistan transformed. Of course, you're all ready to hear this, you've heard it many times. But I'm looking at a couple of things, and one is that I would like to sort of bring us together on what success in this negotiated peace process actually means. And it's very important for Kabul also to define success as it is for the Americans, because obviously the Americans have been an occupying power and have shaped how the country responds in many ways. So success and its definitions for the peace process to me is very important. Also, secondly, um, there's concern about chronic violence in Afghanistan, and there's concern because we're right next door. There's concern from many other countries, but particularly as a woman in Pakistan, and I define my identity very particularly because women are not always included in the process and peace process beyond tokenism in Afghanistan, and certainly that demographic, including the youth demographic, has surely changed. So I want to address how this violence that continues to remain endemic is to be addressed at a time, after 20 years of being engaged, at a time when clearly the end game looks like it's going to be giving a great amount of power and power sharing to those who have not yet given up violence as a means to attaining power. So that is of concern, and of course, how it spills over to Pakistan. And thirdly, I want to sort of bring up how uh, the chronic schizophrenia that we are looking at about Pakistan's role in this transition and endgame. I of course understand and I recognize that there's been worry about Pakistan treating Afghanistan as its strategic backyard. However, I think from the 2010 or 11, there's been a clear and constant moving away, a phased moving away from that, both that thought process in Pakistan as well as a recognition that Afghanistan must make its own decisions and that Pakistan or Islamabad must not have any irons in on the fire, if you like, or broker peace with only a particular Pakhtun group coming to mind, this time the Taliban. So Taliban government is not Pakistan's lever into Afghanistan. Certainly, Pakistan has interests because we are the longest border, and the history is very clear. Um President Karzai used to talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan as Siamese twins. And this is my fourth point. And Pakistan has put up, after a long time, a border and some kind of physical barriers to taking responsibility, taking physical barriers to movement that is free and untrammeled. And clearly, that is a prohibition for terrorist groups. That has been a bone of contention. Boundaries often are. But the idea here is to bring to the table the ability to take responsibility for one's soil and be able to then also adjudicate with each other peacefully as to how we can contain the kind of non-state actors and the violence that we have been talking about for many, many years. I'm not going to raise issues of Afghanistan state solvency and how it would be setting terms for a political post endgame future. But I think these are questions will all be, better than me how, in ways that we're looking at examining. But structurally, I'm still looking to understand how a withdrawal at this time, with Taliban forces very strong, will exclude those forces from assuming extremely powerful positions in a negotiated transition, and what the bargain will look like. So I would be very interested in understanding um, how state stability, political power, solvency, and the fragility of vulnerable groups will be strengthened. This is very important, and it is linked and should be linked to expectations of success, because we have, as you know, in the past seen benchmarks of what constitutes a term of reference, or what constitutes any kind of credible movement forward. So the legitimacy of those benchmarks has obviously dissolved away as the Taliban have gained ascendancy, and certain and the limits to their power appear to be right now a little fluid, uh, and it is of concern as to how this will play out. And lastly, I quickly want to say, well, while we talk about the schizophrenia, talk about um, I see a headline in today's, because Pakistan's papers, which says compliance with UN curbs against Afghan Taliban ordered. I'll just put it up for you. It's right here. I don't know how much you can see this. And this is about the Haqqani network and other groups in operating in Afghanistan, and how Pakistan must comply with bans and prohibitions on them. At the same time, of course, Pakistan is expected to be able to control them to some extent. And that, to me, is a very contentious question as to who has the capacity and ability to control such groups, which the United States has not been able to, with the constant, justified with the constant refrain that Pakistan has been providing a haven. Having said that, I think the whole fencing exercise also paves the way for ending those safe haven conversations, because countries with autonomous, as sovereign countries, with borders that they control autonomously, operates exactly as borders, and with some sort of control on who comes and who goes out. So I think these questions to me are very important. The overhang of history is immense, and the whole point of looking at this entire two-phase negotiation is that we learn from older experiences, particularly the ones that Riaz Saab has written about. And I look forward to learning from you, and understanding how my concerns and many others would be addressed. So, without much ado, I would ask our moderator to set the ball rolling, and look at how we can come to some kind of conclusive commonality or common ground as to how this shapes up and who takes responsibility for what goes down in Afghanistan. The catchword and cliche literally in Pakistan now for the last 20 years is, well, 10 years, is that the Afghanistan must shape peace on its own terms, the Afghan led, Afghan formed. Um, so with that, sort of with those words, I want to leave you open to talk about how that will play out. And of course, Afghan owned and Afghan led is the best guarantee of a politically feasible bargain and a future that protects all the groups that have who seek their liberties, who worry about their liberties, and who seek their protections now after so many years of change and investment in growth. So, civil society, women, youth, how are these demographics going to become part of the inclusive power bargain? And we've constantly heard that the intra-Afghan dialogue will ensure that, but it's taken a while coming because the terms of that dialogue, the freeing of Taliban prisoners and the freeing of some hardened militants, has been a cause of concern all round. While Pakistan is told that we must rein them in, the terms of the agreement that the United States is brokering, and I feel not as a neutral broker, are actually a cause for concern. And how are we going to square this difficult circle? So, thank you very much for the patience and for providing your expertise.
Sherry, thank you very much for setting a panoramic context for our deeper conversation. You rightly made a very correct call for an inclusive peace. And how can we get there? I think you've raised four major questions. One is, what would success look like? What would it mean for Afghanistan and for its neighbors? How can we reduce and eventually eliminate violence? And then there's the pertinent question about what you call chronic schizophrenia, about Pakistan's role, which has been one constant over the last more than 4 decades. And finally, the character, the nature, and the strength of Afghanistan's state and its sustainability. Taking these questions as a larger context, I want to first come to our Afghan speakers to get a sense of quickly a sense of situation on the ground, sentiments on the ground. I want to ask you, Dr. Zakhalwal, first. We just had the Grand Loya Jirga earlier this month, which gave an endorsement to President Ghani's government to go ahead and release the last remaining hardened prisoners necessary in order to initiate the intra-Afghan dialogue. You know that lawyer Jirga, it has been analyzed, and it seems there's a lot of political momentum going on in addition to the news around the palace in Kabul, the presidential palace in Kabul, as well as the Taliban. Can you give us a sense of what are the current political constituencies within Afghanistan? How are they approaching this process? What are their expectations? What are their aspirations? To what extent are they influential on the negotiations between the Taliban and the Kabul government?
And I believe this question is to me.
That's right, sir. Because you are very involved as a politician. You're currently involved in a lot of constituency politics associated with the peace process. If you could share with us the mood on the ground in Afghanistan, the political mood on the ground.
Well, first, let me once again say salam and greetings to everybody. Barney, Ambassador Samad there, and many other colleagues, Madam Rahman. Um, and I also want to tell you that I have a weak internet connection. So I actually lost quite a bit of what Madam Rahman was talking about, picked up. You did a good summary of it, so that helped. And I also lost a bit of the questions that you put, but at the end, I think I understood what the question was. Um, well, um, unfortunately, um, in Kabul, um, um, we still have a lack of unity um, on our position with respect to peace, not only in the broader political spectrum, but also perhaps I would say even within the government. Um, a lack of, um, let's say, um, a unified definition still. Um, Peace means what? Peace is, um, let's say, a complete overhaul of the current state in government, or if it's expected that the government will be running as it is, and the Taliban, like previously with Hikmatyar, Taliban will come and be part of it. Um, so that, and I think there are different, not only sort of um, on different positions on the nationalistic level or the national level, let's say, in the national agenda, but then there are different political ambitions. You know, that has to do with personal powers and all that, and that certainly for those who are in the position of power, then they become more influential with respect to dictating terms and stuff. That's why there is, you see contradictory position from the same people, from the same positions. You see that over the past 1 year or 2 years since Ambassador Khalizad has taken over, um, there are public disagreements as to how Ambassador Khalizad um, um, handled the peace process, or let's say different positions. Some endorse former President Karzai, who is an influential figure throughout Khalizad process, endorsed his activities and was supportive. Dr. Abdullah, the same to a larger extent, but President Ghani, and I'm not saying that one position is wrong and one is right. Ghani, President Ghani has his own logic, because he was the president. He was expecting that he would be very much in the loop, but he was not as much in the loop with respect to the US Taliban talks. And then came um, the negotiations by the U.S. For things that ordinarily the Afghan government should have negotiated, the release of 5,000 prisoners. So, yes, position was no logical by President Ghani that he's not negotiated, so why should he release? But at the end, the U.S. is the U.S., and he gave in. He released most of them, and then finally the final 400, and finally the 5, 6, or 10 people. At the end, my expectations is that probably all will be released, but it took 7 6 7 months, or will be taking almost 6 7 months soon, which could have been done in 10 days maybe if there was more of a cohesive and coordinated in a unified stand, either rejecting all 5,000 or accepting. It didn't have to. It didn't look good actually. Finally, yes, it led to President Ghani convening the Loya Jirga, which at the end all the political leaders supported. And
We seem to have a problem with Dr. Zakhalwal's connection. Let me, while we wait for his connection to restore, let me quickly move to Ambassador Omar Samad. Ambassador Samad, could you give us a sense of the current political mood in Afghanistan, vis-a-vis the start of an intra-Afghan dialogue? Dr. Zakhalwal seems pessimistic in terms of internal divisions, uh, within the political actors. What kind of, what kind of solidarity or unified front can President Ghani's government present in the case of an intra-Afghan dialogue? What is your sense?
Thank you. Good morning and good evening to all of you, and thank you so much to Jinnah Institute for this invitation, and glad to be part of this very expert panel. Uh, I think that we are going through a difficult phase of trying to put together coalitions, as well as making sure that Afghans are agreeing to the steps that have to be taken towards intra-Afghan. It is a difficult process. There are those in Afghanistan who are firm believers in a peace process with all its flaws as well as its shortcomings and challenges. And there are those who I think see the peace process as a threat and would like to undermine it in any way possible. And there are those in the middle who actually are not only confused, but they are dealing and grappling with daily challenges, from COVID to poverty to insecurity, and more importantly, uncertainty about the future. You have several constituencies right now that are trying to, I think, create some kind of understanding about what is happening and what should happen. You obviously have the Taliban on one hand, who feel strengthened, who feel like they are in ascendancy, they feel like they have reached some of their strategic goals, one way or the other. They feel like they have convinced the United States through the past few years of intense warfare. Let's not forget that we have had very intense moments of warfare in Afghanistan, that this war cannot be won, and that they have reached a point where we need to all agree on a political solution and an end to war in Afghanistan. Now, how is this going to shape, and what consequences will it have, is obviously the million-dollar question, which we will address today. But that constituency of the Taliban is obviously in control of territory. It's control of certain parts of the population, and it also has, whether we like it or not, to admit some support in the grassroots of Afghanistan, especially in villages, in places where people have been hurt, in places where injustice has been bestowed upon people, in places where corruption has also been a factor, etc., etc. So that's one. Number two, you have the Kabul, I would say the Kabul bubble, the Kabul regime, which centers around President Ghani, and obviously has its own narratives, it has its own interests, it has its own viewpoint and worldview and connections and support systems that sustain it to this point. And it's offering a formula in a model that obviously some people buy into, some people do not, and some people think that should be part of a solution in the future if we are to have an inclusive outcome in Afghanistan. Then you have those political elites, those in positions of power and influence in Afghanistan, who are sort of sitting on the fence, who are hedging their bets, who think that we may be looking, we have to probably look toward a third path, which would be inclusive. And I'm not saying a third path that would be non-inclusive or exclusionary, but a path that would bring together all the elements that count in Afghanistan in order to create that sustainable outcome and inclusive outcome. Now, there are differences of opinion, as Dr. Zakharwal alluded to, in the political elites and the influence peddling center of Afghanistan, which makes it very difficult. And then fourth item, obviously, is the population overall. They are tired. They are war weary and war afflicted. They are poorer now than they were 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and they are looking for a solution as fast as possible. And I don't think they have the appetite for more years of warfare and destruction in the country, because they are the ones paying the price, and they are the ones whose sons and brothers and husbands die every day, whether on this front or the other front. And so they're looking for a quick solution to all this. So this is how I see the situation inside Afghanistan. And obviously, as you know, there are regional implications, and then there are international implications that we will get to later on. Thank you.
We'll come to that. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Samad. Dr. Zakhalwal, you were cut off because of internet problems. Would you like to make a? We lost him again. We'll move on to, while we wait for him, we'll move on to our speakers in the U.S., Professor Weinbaum and Barney. This is the presidential election year in the U.S. In November. Afghanistan seems to be an issue and then not. Professor Weinbaum, to what extent is Afghanistan a decisive factor in the presidential debate?
Well, if you allow me, let me come back to that because I think there are some larger issues involved here. In effect, I may be asking your leave to be a skunk in the party, at the party. I think we're treating this in our discussion here and elsewhere as if this is a typical power struggle, as if this is the kind of struggle that we generally know how to deal with. It's one in which you bring the parties together, you find common ground, you build confidence, and ultimately you reach some kind of power sharing arrangement, maybe imbalanced, but that's the basis of it. What I'm arguing here, and have argued for some time now, is that no, this is a values conflict. This is a class of conflicts which the world has known as along with power conflicts. It's one that Afghanistan has known. There have been at least 5, I'll add 6 if I want to put in 1929. There have been 6 distinguishable conflicts, civil conflicts in this time, of which this is just the most recent and maybe the most virulent. But these are conflicts in which there is no negotiated solution. There can be none, because you have a clash of values which cannot be compromised. And these conflicts, unfortunately, end with one party ultimately dictating the outcome. Now, these conflicts can end, and they have, but not one of these during this period of time was negotiated. Not one. There is not in Pakistan's recent history an example of where the Afghans could negotiate a conflict successfully and to end the conflict successfully. There is no example. And what I'm arguing here is that, therefore, all that we're talking about is around the idea that somehow there can be a comprehensive, sustainable conflict if only we find the formula, if only we stick to it long enough. And I'm saying no, history, including Afghanistan's history, suggests otherwise. And I think this is very important because we have devoted so much of our energies to this. All we have to see, and I won't take much more time on this because I could go on with it, obviously, but if we just look at what has happened over the last few years, and we can't even get to the table with them. This is unheard of, where you can't bring the combatants after this period of time, whether directly or indirectly, together at the table. They don't even, the Taliban, recognize their main adversaries here, the Kabul government. What we have, again, is the fact that we've got a clash of different visions of what the end state looks like. And these are not compatible, sadly so. coming to the U.S., I think that clearly the timetable of the set by the presidential election has meant that everybody is making their calculations with this in mind, that the United States is on its way out, perhaps sooner because of the election. But ultimately, it's not going to make very much of a difference, I believe, which party wins. The U.S. has decided that enough is enough. And so I don't see the election results, at least. The election itself may be a factor, but the election results, I don't believe, is going to make much of a difference in the course of events. And let me stop on that.
Thank you, Professor Weinbaum. You've been very categorical in your position in a widely circulated article that was published last week in the National Interest. You've expounded on your view about this being a clash of two different worlds, two different value systems, and if that is the case, which a lot of people would tend to agree with you, then why is there such a strong narrative on the need to preserve the gains since 2001? And Barney, I'd like to come to you with this question, because you've invested a lot of time in trying to decipher the Taliban. You've spoken to them publicly in your writings. You're concerned with questions as to whether the Taliban have the potential to change, or if this is really a singular attempt by the Taliban to impose their view. And by going by the comments of Dr. Zakhalwal and Ambassador Samad, the internal divisions in Afghanistan may not be able to put up with strong resistance. Then why the case for preserving the gains in Afghanistan? And can the Taliban change? Could you unmute yourself, Barney?
Sorry for that. Okay, yes, thank you very much for the invitation, for organizing this. Look, I think to ask whether the Taliban can change or have changed is the wrong question. Of course the Taliban have changed, and they can change. That doesn't mean they'll change to be what we want them to be. It might change to be something we like even less, but you don't go to war with the United States for 20 years and not change. The other side in Afghanistan, or the other sides, have also changed. The United States has also changed. So the question is not have they changed. The question is how have they all changed, and how has the situation changed, and what opportunities comes out of that situation. I don't agree with Marvin's whole worldview that somehow people are members of I don't know, rigid blocks that can never talk to each other. You know, it's just, that's how we got the Cold War. That's how we got our ridiculous policy toward Iran and so on. And he and I are tired of arguing about it, because we've done this at least 50 times in the past several decades. So I won't go further into that. Now, the situation, and let's not forget also that when we talk about Afghan-led, or the ideological orientation of the Afghan parties, Afghanistan is one of the most poor countries, one of the poorest countries in the world. It is a landlocked country. There is no political actor in Afghanistan who is not dependent on external aid. The government in Kabul is dependent on billions of dollars that it receives, or that Afghanistan or parties in Afghanistan receive every year from the United States and its friends. The Taliban are dependent on assistance that they receive elsewhere in the Muslim world, from their revenues, from their ties to international drug trade, and from the safe haven that their leadership enjoys in Pakistan, where they're able to operate with impunity, have their headquarters, and so on. And there's a problem that, which is, by the way, not at all unusual, despite what Marvin says, of the non-recognition of the two sides of the party. That is more the rule than the exception in conflicts, you know. By the way, a peace process doesn't mean that there's peace as soon as you say there's a peace process. It comes at the end. And the fact that war is going on and people have extremely different points of view, if they didn't have extremely different points of view, we wouldn't have a war for 40 years, and we wouldn't need a peace process. So the fact that a peace process, by definition, starts during the war, when there are widely different points of view. But the fact is, all sides are dependent I think one of the factors that has made it more possible now than before to start moving toward a peace process is that there is more consensus among the great powers and the powers in the region that this war has just been too disruptive for the international order. And there are various reasons that they would like to end it, even if they haven't agreed on the terms. I should also say that some of these delays are very understandable. The Taliban didn't recognize the Afghan government, wouldn't negotiate with the Afghan government, so they wanted to negotiate with the United States. When President Ghani came to power, he said, "We're not going to make peace with the Taliban. We're first going to make peace with Pakistan." So he wanted a process that would start with Pakistan, and they had the meeting in Murree, Pakistan, which was hosted by Pakistan, and it was Taliban brought by Pakistan, and that didn't go anywhere because Taliban don't want to be. They want to have their own office in Doha and be an independent political actor, not puppets of Pakistan. And now the Afghan government is also resisting carrying out things that the United States should do because the Taliban negotiated with the Americans. The Afghan government was just puppets of the United States, and they're not. So it's only natural that before entering into negotiations, the Afghan government wants to assert and show that they are not puppets of the United States. They have their own interests and their own authority. And this is all the type of pre-negotiation that we can only expect before getting to this difficult negotiation. Now, the problem is that the United States is making its decisions about this really not based on the situation in Afghanistan or the outcome in Afghanistan, but on the political imperatives of the various political actors in the United States. And it's not feasible to solve this problem by the time the election occurs in November or the inauguration happens in January. The United States may decide to withdraw its troops or something. The most important thing for the United States to do, and I hope that it will, is to continue to provide the economic support that is necessary for the institutions in Afghanistan to continue to function despite the country's poverty. And that will provide an environment where they can try, where the various Afghan groups, who none of whom claim that they have irreconcilable differences and nothing to talk about with the other side, it will give them the time and space to try to work out how they may be able to live together in this changing international environment.
Thank you, Barney. I think that's a different positioning from Dr. Weinbaum's, and I agree with you that peace building is a long process. Will go beyond the presidential elections in the U.S. Ambassador Riaz, I come to you. You have looked at Afghanistan through the decades. You've been witness to the previous peace agreements that Dr. Weinbaum alluded to. This time, how is the current process different from the past? And especially in terms of the reach of Afghanistan's neighbors and the international community, do you see any more investment of the international community and Afghanistan's neighbors in ensuring genuine peace in Afghanistan this time? Is there a reset in Pakistan's approach in particular to bring peace once and for all to Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. Let me start with something which Barney had just said, that Afghans cannot be puppets of anybody. And we had the experience in the Geneva negotiations. The last issue which was resolved at Geneva was not the time frame, not other things, etc. It was a formulation on the border, which Kabul, at that time, Najibullah's people, they refused to accept. They said no reference to border. And without a reference to border, Geneva would have been meaningless. Shevardnadze, who was foreign minister, came to Kabul, sat there for 3 days, could not convince Kabul. Then they had to basically contact the Pakistanis and ask them, can you agree to some kind of a fuzzy formulation on that? And that fuzzy formulation is part of the Geneva Accords. So the Afghans are nobody's puppets. I agree with you on it. Now, you had mentioned about these old agreements. I don't want to go into any details. I think there is a difference between the earlier agreements, earlier processes, and this process. The first difference that I see in this process is that this is the first time when all the stakeholders they are participating in the process. Earlier at Geneva, the Mujahideen were out of it. Then you had the Bonn, the Taliban were out of it. So that is one difference. The second difference, in my view, is that the major international player, which is United States, is far more deeply engaged today with Afghanistan than the Soviet Union was in 1987, 88, and 89. And I would say that by 87, there was an effort by Soviet Union and by Pakistan later on. We missed that opportunity. If there was an opportunity for a government of national reconciliation, along with the, of course, question of withdrawal of Soviet troops. But that was rejected by the Mujahideen Tanzimat, because by 1987 and 88, they all had eyes on Kabul. So they were not prepared to listen. There was a statement by the UN Secretary General at the time of the Geneva signing that he would engage in the formation of a broad-based or government of national reconciliation, but Cordovez was rebuffed by the Tanzimat, and that was the end of it. The other peace processes, Peshawar Accords, etc., that was an anomaly. It was brought about by a urgent situation in Kabul, created by, first of all, the collapse of the Soviet Union and then collapse of Najibullah regime. Najibullah had taken refuge in. And that, I would say, was basically a triumph of diplomacy and politics by Burhanuddin Rabbani Sahib. He very cleverly managed his relationships with the other Tanzimat. I can tell you that there was not an iota of contribution of Pakistan in the Peshawar agreements. And finally, it facilitated the entry of Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud into Kabul. That was an achievement, remarkable achievement by Burhanuddin Rabbani Sahib. So that was Peshawar. Bonn, of course, from Pakistan's point of view, I would say that it was a mistake to have lumped the Taliban together with Al-Qaeda and declared them as terrorists. Secondly, the other aspect was that soon after, within 2 years, the American attention was diverted to Iraq, and Afghanistan, in a way, was ignored, and that gave the possibility for the Taliban to revive and regroup. Anyway, that is past. Now the situation, I think Ambassadors Zakhiwal and Ambassador Samad, they have already given the ground situation. To me, it looks a bit, I would look at it half glass full rather than half glass empty. Why I say that? One never expected the 29 February agreement to be a silver bullet. And there are no silver bullets in any Afghan process, if it is to be a process. But there are certain positive indicators. First of all, I think both the ambassadors have referred to this fatigue. People are tired. Yes. So that is a positive factor which plays in favor of the peace process. So that is one thing. Then there have been developments. 29th February agreement itself is a development which should be seen positively. Yes, there are reservations by the Afghan government, but Afghan government is now back into the very much involved. Then there have been, in a very unique kind of a way, agreement on the prisoners that hopefully will take place. There are many challenges of constitutional nature, challenges of violence, ceasefire, the question of the Islamic Republic versus the Islamic, what is it called, Emirate. There are the question of women's rights, minorities. So there are many pitfalls, but nonetheless there are certain positive developments as we see. I look at, for example, Abdullah Sahib's leading the peace, the dialogue, Afghan dialogue from the government side, as a very positive development, because I think he is a very effective. He can be a very effective negotiator with the Taliban. There was this question of the Taliban.
Ambassador Riaz, sorry, I want to ask you specifically, do you see a change in Afghanistan's neighbors' approach who have traditionally been engaged in the history of Afghanistan's conflict? Do you see
Okay.
a radical change,
Okay.
especially in
Okay,
Pakistan?
but let me just say one thing, that the Taliban are no longer the Taliban of the 90s. Taliban are also different. They are far more exposed to the world today, anyway, and more savvy in terms of negotiations, etc. Now, your question. Yes, I think the first thing we must recognize that it is no longer the Afghanistan of 1990s, late 1990s, which was totally isolated and insular in the true sense of the word. Today, even if United States withdraws, and I don't think that it will withdraw lock, stock, and barrel in the manner that the Soviet Union had withdrawn, so it will remain engaged. So in some way, it will remain engaged. So first of all, that is the difference. Even if their engagement is reduced to a minimal level, there would be other countries who would remain engaged. I think China will remain engaged, Russia will remain engaged, others will remain engaged, and Afghanistan is no longer isolated. Pakistan's, there are many question marks, etc. But whatever I see over here, whatever I hear, Pakistan is also suffering from the same kind of fatigue as the Afghans are suffering as a result of this continuation of the conflict. And we would like to see some kind of a stability in Afghanistan. We have many concerns. We have concerns, for example, that the Afghan territory is not used against Pakistan. That's a genuine concern. But apart from that, I think Pakistan is ready that whatever facilitation we can give, we should be able to give. But Pakistan's role, it is an inescapable role because of demographics, because of geography, because of so many things. But Pakistan has to play it very sensitively, because if we try to seek this role and if we try to push for this role, then it is going to basically raise hackles, and it is going to draw reservations from one party or the other. We should play this role in tandem with the United States, which has, of course, a very special role over there because of its presence, and secondly, with the Afghans themselves, the Afghan government and the other Afghan major factions who are there. Now, lastly, I would say that what is it that we can look for? First of all, we should look for whether the violence is reducing or not. If the violence is reducing, it's a positive factor. Secondly, we should look for whether the parties, various Afghan parties, they remain engaged or they do not remain engaged. There is a breakdown completely, or as it is today, they are engaged in some way. And it's a mix of international meetings like in Qatar, or the domestic arrangements like the Loy Jirga, which has taken place. So is this kind of engagement continuing? So what do we look for? look for reduction of violence and this kind of engagement. And hopefully, in the end, a situation emerges where there is a, uh, a governance uh, in which the Afghans, Taliban, are also become participants, such as, for example, a reference was made to Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. He's sitting in Kabul. You know the history very well. So, can that kind of situation be reached with the Taliban and there is some kind of a power sharing? And more importantly, more than that, Taliban would want that wherever they have influence, they also have control, similar to what outside in the outside parlance, I don't know how the Afghans look at it, they're called warlords. So warlords have, in different sub-regions, their influence, which is more consolidated. So can that situation be replicated in south and southwest of Afghanistan for the Taliban? So if those kinds of things start, and then most importantly, I think the economics is going to play the role. If there is economic development in that country is going to change. And I hope that the others, United States, which has also, I think, a certain responsibility for security to see that things do not collapse. It doesn't collapse into a civil war situation. Then also others, China, for example, Russia, also Pakistan, in a way, that they have to see to it that Afghanistan has moves towards economic progress and development, and some of these gains over the last 20 years they are preserved.
Okay,
So
Imran Sahab,
I
I want to, before we lose Dr. Zakhalwal again, because he's been having internet issues, I want to quickly turn to Dr. Zakhalwal. Dr. Zakhalwal, the points raised by Dr. Weinbaum, Bani, and Riaz Khan Saab, it looks like, and from your own observations, if the domestic constituencies in Afghanistan, those the non-Taliban constituencies, if they remain divisive, if they have not been able to achieve the strong agency in order to effectively negotiate with the Taliban, at the same time, there's a fast changing regional and international environment which is surrounding the Afghan conflict. There's a fast changing global power competition arising. There's internationalism at play here that Riaz Khan Saab has alluded to when he says that Pakistan has to be very careful in terms of not seeking a very active role in Afghanistan lest it raises hackles. That raises the question of foreign policy and international politics continuing to impact Afghanistan peace process as it evolves. From your perspective, will foreign policy and Afghanistan's future relations with its neighbors and the international community, including the US, to what extent will that be a negotiating point between the Taliban and President Ghani's government? How would a post conflict Afghanistan, considering that it has never been anybody's puppet, as our panelists have said, how would it conduct its foreign relations with an international community which is clearly more invested in it today than it was before? Dr. Zakhalwal, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm back. Yes. Can you again ask the question because I lost the end of it?
Sure. So the international community, including the US and the multilateral community, is much more invested in Afghanistan today than it was. It has been in the past. And old partners like Pakistan have to be careful in terms of their strategic calculus in seeing a future role. What kind of foreign policy posture would any future Afghan dispensation have to tackle moving forward in a peace process? I think we're Ambassador Zakhilwal. Can you hear us? I think we're having net issues with Dr. Zakhilwal. While we wait for him, Ambassador Samad, would you care to comment on the international and regional dynamics as they have changed, and how a future dispensation in Afghanistan? What would be some of the key challenges for a future dispensation in Afghanistan to tackle?
Well, first, it all depends on how do we reach to this future dispensation. It very much depends on what a peace settlement and a political settlement would look like. And then, obviously, taking into consideration Afghanistan's needs and priorities. Yes, it was alluded to that there will still be a need for development and economic assistance, and even I would add investment. You see, we cannot build and develop and invest unless we have a certain degree of stability and peace in Afghanistan. This has been proven in the past 20 years with so much money that has been allocated to Afghanistan. Everything is very fragile today. So we would need that level of stability and security and peace in order to be able to engage everyone and those stakeholders who are interested in helping Afghanistan. But first and foremost, Afghans have to agree on this political package. Afghans have to find the right level of consensus on what kind of state, what kind of political and power sharing arrangement, what happens to the constitution, what happens to the role of women and youth and different constituencies in the country whose rights are as important as anything else. And how do we solve the problems that we have inherited from the past? You see, I think that there are so many lessons to be learned from what Marvin alluded to in 1920s all the way to today, from what works best in Afghanistan in terms of state building and nation building and what doesn't. There are a lot of lessons that we Afghans have to draw from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s and all the way to today. Yes, given our geography, given our landlocked position, given our shortcomings, and given our assets and the Afghan the positive side of what Afghanistan can offer the region and the world. So, how do we tackle, for example, the threats of terrorism from here on? The international community has still to be involved because that threat of terrorism will have to be dealt with, and we are all hoping that the Taliban will play a positive role in that. And we're all hoping that the international community will continue to play an effective role without having to spend so much money or be involved in at large scale with a big footprint in Afghanistan. So the region obviously has its issues, but I think that there is more consensus now than there was in the past. I think that there is more consensus inside Afghanistan than we had a year or two ago, but it's still not solid enough, and it's still not focused enough, and it's still facing challenges, and it's facing, unfortunately, very troubling spoiler tactics. And so we need to overcome these in order to be able to reach that political consensus and settlement, then move on to economics and state building again. There are big hurdles ahead, but again, I want to stress there are many lessons to be learned from the past, and we Afghans need to make sure that we do not repeat those mistakes and that we learn the right lessons on what works best and
Thank you,
what doesn't work best
Dr.
for
Samad.
Afghanistan.
I want to take your point about the need, about the threat of the spoilers. I want to tie it to Sherry's, last very important point, and this is going to be my last intervention. We've lost, unfortunately, Dr. Zakhilwal. He's excused because of poor internet connection. uh, the need for finally establishing a functional, sustainable state in Afghanistan, and how, because of the country being historically an arena for global power politics, that has been the big detriment. I want to put this question bluntly to Dr. Weinbaum and Dr. and Barney. you know Given the current global and regional power plays, there are new power alignments happening. If an overall international system remains anarchic, if it remains aligned along conflict, Afghanistan will also remain vulnerable to the kind of proxy warfare scenarios or the spoiler scenarios that Ambassador Samad has pointed to. And Sherry's question will remain unanswered as to how and when can we establish a functional and solid state apparatus in Afghanistan. So how do you see the international conflict environment, whether it is receding or whether that will continue to impact the peace process in Afghanistan? What is your take, Dr. Weinbaum?
Well, I would turn it around a little bit. I don't think all of the developments, which are very, very favorable, the region, I think, has a better sense of itself now. The desire for interconnectivity is very real, and the opportunities, I think, have been spelled out very nicely. They all hinge on there being peace in Afghanistan. None of these really can come to fruition without that. So, well, the good news here also is that none of these countries want to see a return of anything like the Islamic Emirate of the 1990s, or anything which in any way presents the possibility of the export of radical militant Islam to their own place. So it's an interesting time that we have now, in that the opportunities are greater than they've ever been in terms of a regional solution here. They all need the same thing. They need stability. They could use a prospering Afghanistan. My basic argument, of course, is that this depends on the ability of the Afghans themselves. One Afghan analyst, Muradian, put it very well. He said, until you have reconciliation among Afghans themselves, and then you have reconciliation among the region of players, only then could you even think of trying to negotiate with the Taliban for reconciliation. And that's aside from the fact that I'm arguing of the real difficulties of that kind of reconciliation. And I'd add only one thing more. Again, judging from recent history, what has been a mainstay, I think, of what we have viewed here is that in none of the discussions that have gone on, dialogue that has taken place, and negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, in none of this has the Taliban ever yielded on any issue which they considered a matter of principle. I defy anyone to tell me where they have really compromised. I think what they have done here is to use diplomacy very effectively, and have resulted here in their gaining legitimacy, in their getting what their main objective has been all this time, to get the foreign forces out. They seem to be on the way to getting that. And finally, they want the release of the prisoners, and they're holding out notice. They're holding out the last person. They could have certainly have finessed this, say, well, we'll release them once we get started a little bit. But no, they have recognized in all of these experiences that if they stand firm, they will get what they want, because the other side is desperate to get a peace process
Barney,
underway.
quick comment by you. Do you share Dr. Weinbaum's optimism about the neighbors being aligned and being on the same page, not to let past conflicts spill over? Do you share that optimism?
I would never use the word optimism, nor would I use the word pessimism, but I think it is true that compared to the past, for all the reasons Marvin and others have laid out, there is much more consensus in the region than before. I should add, however, that the big question is really the role of the United States. What there is not consensus about so much is what should the role of the United States be, because the United States' involvement is also necessary for the regional cooperation around Afghanistan because of its role in keeping the state going. And yet, as long as the U.S. has the same kind of very intense hostile relationship hostile relationships that it does with so many of Afghanistan's neighbors, it's going to be difficult to accommodate the need for regional cooperation and the President of the United States. Perhaps that will change in the future. As far as the Taliban's never having given up on anything, I can recall for many, many years hearing, I don't know, Marvin, if you said it, but I heard it from many people, I won't mention their names, that the Taliban have made it extremely clear that they will never negotiate until all the U.S. troops are out of Afghanistan. And I was told that over and over again. And now the U.S. troops are still in Afghanistan, and they're prepared to not only they negotiate with the United States, they're prepared to negotiate with the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan while the American troops are still in Afghanistan, and they don't really have a solid guarantee that they will leave by the deadline given in the talks. So, of course, you can always say that's nothing. Of course, you can always dismiss the other side's concessions because they're not everything you want. But from their point of view, that was a very major concession.
Thank you, Barney. Sherry, I know you've been waiting very patiently, and you have some responses for Barney. May I request you to
Yes.
please respond, and also to please sum up with your closing remarks.
No, I think Ambassador Riaz Khan is trying to say something, and we need to go back to him. He's trying to say something. Riaz Bhai, can you hear me? We'll just come back to you. I'm not closing, and I need to, I need to put this to the house here. What I'm hearing is, and I would like a quick, actually, 4-minute formulation from everyone, and that's how we close this. I want to restructure this. What I want to hear from everyone is, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not hearing two important things. There is no clarity on who will guarantee this peace. Obviously, there is no guarantor, but there is no clarity on that, let alone any clarity on what outcomes we are looking at, even in any timeline future. There seems to be a lack of commitment on the American side to stay the course or to form a bipartisan policy on Afghanistan beyond the prospect of a precipitous exit, while the responsibility for containing violence or maintaining law and order at the borders, and which even includes crime, but principally terrorism and militancy, are not really parceled out. I don't see the financial or military wherewithal of the Afghan National Security Forces to maintain peace or any kind of even stable, and I'm presenting an extreme formulation. I want to hear that this is the plan. I'm not, number one, hearing any plan, and I'm hearing very important things from Mr. Samad, and we're sorry to have lost Khalilwal. What I'm hearing is that we're all divided about important enabling features to any state solvency in peace. I mean, there is no guarantor. Clearly, Afghanistan needs one. And in terms of financial and military or security wherewithal and muscle to maintain Kabul's sovereignty, literally, over Afghanistan. So if that is not happening, and it clearly is not, then we need to hear about what alternative futures you are seeing, because there's disagreement even between Mr. Weinbaum and Mr. Rubin, and I'm being all formal here, but uh, I think that's important to flesh out at this point instead of my making a all blowout conclusion. I think we need to tease out the zero sum situation here. The Taliban are riding in at a time of their choosing. To many in Pakistan and everywhere else, this seems like an exit where the Taliban are seen as better partners than, say, the Daesh or the Islamic State coming up in the Khorasan, and there are no answers. There is just we don't have answers as to how Afghanistan will come out of this peace process into a stable, united future? Or are we saying that when violence escalates, because violence is already endemic, nobody's addressing that question, that violence, fatigue or not, is still very much a part of day to day life? I still hear the safe haven echo, like there's been no change in Pakistan's behavior, because frankly, there is. And that border is going to be one guarantee of the revolving door used between terrorists that went back and forth. And Afghanistan and Pakistan, principal bodies in Afghanistan and Pakistan see eye to eye on the pivotal and groundbreaking need for some kind of peace overtures that and guarantees that will hold this the new Afghanistan together. So we are not just here to discuss change. And I want to hear, if I may, and I'm pressing you, I know, but I want to hear how we get past the constant posting and flagging of uncertainty, because after 20 years, uncertain outcomes only says one thing for Pakistan, that we will be put in the spoiler box. And I want to see how that is addressed. It's not been addressed, and I really would beg everyone's attention on that, because we're not, I think we're doing everything as Pakistan, inside and outside the box. But here again, today too, take the stick to the Haqqani group, take the stick to XYZ. Yes, we are doing that. We need to do that for our own way forward too. But then what negotiability does Pakistan have? And when no one has any negotiability, well, it's Pakistan's problem. How long is terrorism? My last and final statement on this: terrorism in Afghanistan, that's why there's a border now, uh, cannot be Pakistan's problem constantly. Peace is certainly Pakistan's problem. Who is going to account for terrorism in Afghanistan? Who is going to maintain the state? And who is going to look out for the state, for the state keeping its own peace? Certainly, we are not sending our military, and that's not required. Afghanistan is nobody's puppet. So, what are we doing past the uncertainty? I'm looking to maintain my country's stakes in a fragile friendship with Afghanistan, and a friendship will not be guaranteed by misplaced optimism just because we have nothing else to grasp at. Thank you.
Ambassador Riaz, you had a comment.
I think I'll basically make my last comment because we are in that. I think Sherry is still speaking.
Sherry, sorry, could you unmute yourself, please?
No, I'm not speaking.
Okay. Riazka, please go on.
What? Okay. Well, I'll make my last comment basically after listening to Sherry, because she has made some very important points over here. The comment that I wanted to make at that time was that United States has a very special role, important role, and we were talking about the regional rivalries and regional problems, and one hopes that United States is not going to drag Afghanistan into those arenas. Like, for example, the Afghans, why should they not be able to take advantage of Gawadar or Chabahar for that matter? So the United States should at least turn their face the other way if that kind of situation develops, rather than put any pressure on Afghanistan on that count, because that would be important for Afghanistan's development if that process takes hold. So this is one thing. Secondly, I wanted to say one thing that even long time ago, one had said that peace in Afghanistan, peace and development, peace and stability in Afghanistan will depend on the emergence of a coalition of Afghan factions, Afghan forces, which are capable of promoting peace, which are capable of resolving their divergences in their interests, and which, more importantly, are capable of countering forces of extremism and violence. That has not taken place for the last, say, 30 years, 40 years at least. So hopefully we are into a process. And because we are into a process, I think it is extremely difficult to talk about guarantors and extremely difficult to talk about timelines. There are no timelines. Sherry, I'm sorry. I basically, maybe in your lifetime, you will be able to see stability and, peace and development in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for that matter. But in my lifetime, I don't see that. So, but I want to see whether this process, which is taking shape, whether it maintains its direction. And there I had already said that there are two important elements to watch for. One is the reduction of violence, and secondly, if these contentious factions are coalescing and some progress is made towards a stable arrangement in the Kabul. So, and then, of course, there is the question of development. I think United States and other countries have to see to it that Afghanistan is helped with development. So this is my basic view on this whole issue.
Thank you, Ambassador Riaz. Barney, would you want to comment or respond to Sherry's very pertinent question on the table? Who's going to guarantee, given the uncertainty and the divisiveness, who's going to guarantee non-violence in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that that question is part of the problem. For instance, I'd like to know who's going to guarantee the future of democracy in the United States. I don't know what's going to happen here in 3 months. So the future of Afghanistan cannot be guaranteed. No, the future cannot be guaranteed. We have to tolerate uncertainty with any uncertainty which is necessary for the negotiations to take place. Now, the reason we find it difficult to tolerate that uncertainty is because of the level of mistrust and the fear that someone else will exploit that uncertainty. And it's that uncertainty which led the British to invade Afghanistan twice, which led the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, which led the United States to intervene or invade Afghanistan in 2001 and try to make the future of Afghanistan certain. And as you see, it did not work out very well trying to make the future of any country certain. It cannot be done. But as far as a guarantor, there is a diplomatic process underway, and it's very early stages, like everything else in this process. But it's really quite remarkable that Ambassador Khalilzad has gotten a consensus between Russia, China, and Pakistan on certain basic outlines of the future of Afghanistan and the region. They have invited Iran to join that with U.S.-Iran relations as they are now. That's not possible, but U.S.-Iran relations will not stay this way forever. So I think that to the extent that there will be a guarantor, and to say someone will be a guarantor gives a false hope that anyone can guarantee certainty in the future. They can't. But there will be a multilateral diplomatic framework of which Afghanistan will be the central part, of course, for trying to manage the new pattern of relations in the region and connectivity, maintaining and increasing connectivity, as Marvin said, will be one of the things that will undergird it. So I see not only that more people in there's a bit of a consensus, as Omar said, in Afghanistan toward the need for peace and the unsustainability of conflict and the fact that no one can win, and there's starting to be more of a consensus in the region as well that the region's future needs cooperation, connectivity, and has to find a way not to destroy all of that because of disputes over the poorest country in the region.
Thanks, Barney. Ambassador Samad, quick comment from you before I come to Dr. Weinbaum last.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say what it is that we know, what it is that the reality on the ground is. On one hand, as we said, war and continuation of war and the status quo is really not going to take us forward towards peace. And the Afghan people want peace. And so we should do everything to avoid either status quo or another surge, as some people think it should happen. This is not, this is not a war of values, really. This would be, this is not a war of, civilizational conflict or anything. This is a problem, a very deep problem that exists as a result of war that was imposed on Afghanistan, as a result of invasions that Afghanistan suffered as in the past 40 years, and as a result of some mistakes that were made by Afghans themselves, but also a lot of mistakes along the way by those who tried to help or tried to hurt Afghanistan. And that includes countries in the region. Yes, Afghans have a lot of concern about Pakistan, and they want to make sure that Pakistan also has learned its lessons from the past 40 years or so, that Pakistan also is going to be a good neighbor the same way that Afghans want to be a good neighbor to all their neighbors, and that we resolve our issues once and for all, and that we can live next to each other with respect and respect for our sovereignty. So those are issues that we can address. And so, as far as the U.S. is concerned, I think that if the U.S. leaves while there is no durable or inclusive settlement in Afghanistan, that will in itself lead to a more chaotic situation. But also, if the United States puts up with this condition, the situation right now, the status quo, or even thinks about increasing its footprint again, thinking that for this reason or that reason we need to finish the job, and we could, that again would lead to probably more hurt and no result at the end. So the only option left for everyone is to aim and basically mobilize for an inclusive and a durable peace that brings all Afghans under the tent. The tent is missing a part of the country and a part of the society, and so we need to make sure that it's a full Afghan tent. And then I think, coming to Sherry's question about guarantees, I think the guarantee is the peace dividend. And the peace dividend means continued engagement in Afghanistan, having learned all the lessons from the past, with a smaller footprint, with less money, less corruption, more accountability, and more focus on development that works for everyone, whether that is in the mining sector, whether that is in the agricultural sector, whether that is in transit and trade. All of those areas are areas that can be a win-win for everyone. And so I think that we really need to focus on what is possible, but taking into account what is reality on the ground today. And the realities on the ground mean that we cannot continue the strife that we have inherited from one period to another. And so hopefully the region and the world will also see where their win is. And there is no perfect solution, and there is no zero-sum game in all of this. And I think at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves that there are spoilers. There are all types of different spoilers. There are spoilers within, and there are spoilers without. And we need to make sure that we address them in a way that takes the process forward. And so I'll stop there.
Professor Weinbaum, my final question to you. So, on Sherry's question of guarantors, Barnett's realistic comment that it is difficult to guarantee, put any guarantees when there's a process going on. It seems as if the US role, as Ambassador Riaz Khan has also pointed out, seems to be the key ingredient in some kind of stability for Afghanistan ahead. Now, how that role transitions from that of an invader to a facilitator and a development partner, what's your take on what can bring Afghanistan towards stability and peace?
Let me first address Sherry's point here about guarantors. I took that to mean guarantee the peace treaty that they would reach, because that's really when we think of guarantors. That's what we think of. If there's an agreement, who is going to guarantee it? So I took it in that vein. Uh, Clearly, we're not there, and so I don't think, as everybody else has suggested, anyone is going to be in a position, even if they wanted to be a guarantor. If anything, Afghanistan's a quagmire. You don't get involved if you don't have to. Now, as far as the players, every one of the players is guaranteeing their own security. And the way they're doing it is that what they have always been doing here is that whatever else is going on, they have hedging strategies. And those hedging strategies we see all the time at work. And if there is no solution to this, as I suggest, very unlikely process, what many people in Afghanistan and others who observe this are feared of is a civil war. Because once that becomes clear, then I think that all the players, and there are so many more actors than in the 90s, and that's why we're talking about here the potential of a chaotic civil war. This is the real concern. We've got to avoid that. The US could do that. As long as the international forces are still in the country, we can stave off just that kind of thing. But the United States is going to get out. Most importantly, before the end of the year, it's going to withdraw, very likely, its air power. And that's the key here to stability at the moment. Once that's gone, I really feel we have a game changer on our hands. So I'm sorry that I've been so pessimistic this morning here, but I think we have to call it as it is.
Sherry, do you want to comment on responses to your interjection?
Ed, it's not unmuted.
It is you are unmuted, Sherry.
Yeah. So I without being overly contentious, because this is not about a business of flagging optimism. Marvin, I appreciate what you're saying. I do think that the business of guaranteeing peace naturally comes in after some kind of agreement is in place and some formulation of power sharing or bargain is actually in place. However, my concern is that I'm seeing that the United States exiting without taking responsibility for that exit. It's a proxy for, and I know Barney is going to disagree here, but I honestly think that a lot is not in place. The timeline is crucial to this transition. If those power sharing agreements are not in place, then a precipitous exit will absolutely redefine the condition of who holds power, who executes power, who governs in Afghanistan, or who governs in Kabul. So I think these are concerns. I'm not even calling it a civil war, but given the level of militancy, I do understand Barney saying, well, it's not, our future is not being central to Afghanistan. Absolutely, the United States is not central to Afghanistan, but it has been. It has defined the conditions in Afghanistan for a long time. And I'm not ready for backslapping yet on how Ambassador Khalilzad has been able to push it forward. because I was holding office at the time when we constantly urged the talking to begin, and the United States was not ready. Oh, it was going to be let's soften first. Well, we've seen how the softening played out. The timeline has totally changed the outcome, in my view, of how this endgame plays out. It's endgame for Afghanistan, but it's certainly not endgame for the Taliban. They are in the ascendancy, and if power had to be negotiated or brokered like we had suggested, it should have been done. That conversation should have been started then. But there is no bipartisan policy about Afghanistan in Washington, and I'm afraid that's not the case in Pakistan anymore. So, hey, I think Washington is more broken right now than policy making here. And what we're listening to is one is a very very genuine worry, which is from Professor Weinbaum, that things will spiral down. The other is from Rubin, which is absolutely correct. The key to future stability and peace is making a transition away from the United States, not being central to Afghanistan's future, but the timing of that exit and precipitous endgame is actually crucial. The way it's playing out, it seems that as we always said, the time and the power and the clocks now are all in the Taliban hands, and that is how the United States is leaving it. I want to say it very plainly and close there, because I very strongly feel that that's the time to talk and the time to create a hedge for peace over there was much earlier. Perhaps if Afghanistan is ready to patch its future together, which is of course the ideal situation, then I think we're all in business, and we should be having a seminar on how to take inclusive government forward. Right now, I'm seeing militancy coming out, the freeing of prisoners. The terms are completely in the Taliban's hands, and that seems to be a problem. I really, really want to thank everybody, especially Dr. Professor Omar Samad, for coming on board and looking at things a little with clarity. It's hard to have the kind of future of your country discussed all over the place, and it's not something that we should be doing in any case. It's something Afghanistan should be taking responsibility for. But I think with so many occupiers and problem spoilers in the mix, the time has come for a far more structured, open agreement. I don't see an international conference also like Geneva taking place on Afghanistan, where people are making commitments to at least solvency and making commitments to, for instance, what will happen when the air power is withdrawn. So I worry for Afghanistan, because an unstable Afghanistan means whatever border we make up, at least unstable borderlands for Pakistan. And that is a concern for all of us. I think that's where we all have common ground. And I hope next time we meet, we have better prospects ahead of us. But hope is not a plan, and I don't see one yet.
Thank you, Sherry. Certainly, I think one thing in common amongst all speakers, and on behalf of Jinnah Institute, we're very grateful to each one of you for taking time out on a weekend. We all share genuine worry and care for Afghanistan's future, and I think that's something which has changed over time. I see a lot of potential in Ambassador Riaz Khan and Professor Weinbaum's allusions to the regional alignments as they're occurring, and perhaps Afghanistan's future lies in greater integration within the region with connectivity and economic prosperity as the plan. Jinnah Institute continues to research issues on Afghanistan, around Afghanistan, and we hope to engage with each of our esteemed panelists in future also. I thank you again for your participation. Until next time.
Bye
Thank
now.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.